final years of his life, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, or as we know him, Lenin, had one goal: to spread the communist revolution. Lenin's foreign policy reflected this objective, with actions such as invading Poland, the calling for a coalition of communists, and wavering international trade relations, to name but a few. When Lenin passed away in January 1924, there were 7 main contenders for power, with Stalin and Trotsky leading the pack. After a long 5-year struggle, only one could come out on top, and this was to be Joseph Zhugashvili, more commonly known as Stalin. What the people of the USSR did not know was that life under this abominable and tyrannical dictator was about to get worse and bad times were ahead. At the beginning of the 20s, there were new policies being implemented, such as new laws that legalized abortion and made divorce easier, which caused chaos in society. Falling birth rates, increased homelessness, and instability for work were all commonplace. Things needed to change, and in the mid-30s, there was a positive move back to the older values of pro-family, pro-discipline, and anti-abortion. During the Great Retreat, marriage was taken seriously. Divorce was much harder and more expensive than in the 20s, as well as abortion being outlawed and mothers receiving child benefit support from the state. When politicians make foreign policies, it is because they are influenced by a number of different factors, and this was no different in Stalin's Soviet Union. In the 30s, there were 6 main factors determining Soviet foreign policy: ideology, the need for communist revolution in other countries if socialism was to survive in the USSR, a fear of invasion. The USSR has a 3,200 kilometer long boundary, so attack could come from anywhere. Economic backwardness, which included inferior technology and the urgent need for industrialization. The attitude of other countries, foreign intervention in Soviet affairs. Their internal situation, including the 5-year plan, collectivization, and the Civil War, which all influenced the policy, and the background view of those making the Soviet policy: Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, along with their commissars for foreign affairs: Chicherin, Litinov, and Molotov. In the late 30s, both the USSR and Germany were isolated from the Western powers, partially because of their lack of agreement with the Western nations. In an attempt to secure threats of war, British Prime Minister Chamberlain persuaded Adolf Hitler into signing the Munich Agreement, which was a treaty of peace between the two nations. In exchange for Hitler's approval, the Western Allies gave Germany land, an act which the USSR saw as a demonstration of their weakness, and in turn convinced the Soviet Union to join the Axis. This agreement with the Axis also put the Soviet Union and Japan on friendly terms, which would prevent an attack on 2 fronts for the Soviet Union. By the end of the 30s, the USSR was frail. The purchase had left both the army and the people weakened and demoralized. In order to extend Russian influence over the Baltic, Stalin forced Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia to sign a treaty of mutual assistance. This would allow the USSR to establish Soviet bases in those countries in the case of a breakout of war. He demanded the Finnish islands of Paasikivi and Mannerheim, a request that was promptly denied by the Finns in 1939. By the end of that same year, the Winter's War broke out. The Russians completely outnumbered the Finns and somehow still managed to lose the war in March of 1940. This war not only proved to the world the Russian limitations, but it also spurred Hitler to turn his attention east, as well as it got Russia evicted out of the League of Nations, leaving it without allies. Even though Stalin was convinced that Germany wouldn't strike Russia because they would be too busy fighting the British, in the autumn of 1940, he was alarmed at the fact that the German invasion of Britain had come to a standstill and that Hitler focused his attention on the east. On the 22nd of June, 1941, a German attack on Russia called Operation Barbarossa occurred, and it was without a doubt the largest military attack of World War II. The Germans based their attack on blitzkrieg, a tactic that consisted of speed and surprise, hoping to make an attack so grand that when the attack on Russia starts, the world will hold its breath. Operation Barbarossa ended on the 5th of December 1941, resulting in 5 million Russian deaths and the capturing of about 300,000 soldiers. The attack stopped before reaching Hitler's targets of Leningrad and Moscow due to the harsh winter. However, German attacks on the USSR didn't stop there. In the summer of 1942, Hitler launched Operation Blue on the Soviet Union's oil fields in the Caucasus region, with the objective of capturing Moscow. This operation failed partially because of the destruction of the German Sixth Army in the Battle of Stalingrad in February 1943, resulting in a Soviet victory. Other attacks included Operation Citadel, which also failed, allowing the Russians to force the German army more easily out of the USSR in 1943 through 44. By this time, the Russian army had vastly developed and become more modernized, developing better strategies such as tank armies, shock armies, and the best tank of the war, the T-34 tank. Stalin overlooked all of the war operations and managed to compile a very good cabinet of army generals, especially amongst them General Zhukov, who proved crucial in the development of strategies during key points of the war. In January 1945, Russia, at the hands of Stalin, launched their last attack of the war in Europe, which resulted in the driving of all of the Nazi forces out of Russia and Poland all the way back to Berlin. In August 1945, Stalin declared war on Japan and subsequently managed to take over the Japanese city of Manchuria, destroying all of its forces as well. After World War II ended, Stalin was afraid to break off all the alliances which he had made during the war. However, his new foreign policy was to create the opening phase of the Cold War, which was to last from 1945 to 1991. Even though the Russians fought on the same side as the UK and the United States in the war, there was always distrust between them, which became even bigger at the Yalta and Potsdam conferences from July 17 to August 2, 1945, which included the leaders Stalin from Soviet Union, Harry S. Truman from the United States, and Winston Churchill from the UK. Soon after the conferences, and in fear of the spreading of world communism, Churchill gave the Iron Curtain speech in 1946, and the Truman Doctrine followed soon after in 1947, both depicting the threat of both Stalin and communism to freedom. The Cold War was a power struggle between the United States, who wanted democracy, and the Soviet Union, who wanted to turn Germany communist. No actual fighting ever took place, in fear of more mass destruction after both World War I and World War II. However, the Soviet Union managed to set up satellite states in Eastern Europe who were to remain loyal to them, increasing yet again Stalin's influence over the East. In June of 1948, the Soviets imposed a full blockade in West Berlin to force the Western Allies out of it. This enchained a rift between the Soviet Union and the United States. By August 1949, the Soviet Union had developed atomic aptitude and was able to challenge the other superpower in the United States. Neither side used their nuclear weapons in fear of the appalling results, but they did, however, stand their ground for their particular beliefs. For this, they made use of client states, which were other countries which would defend their respective ideas as well. Amongst the most prestigious were Russian client states, such as China, which later turned communist in 1949, North Vietnam, which led to the Vietnam War from 1955 to 1975, and North Korea, which also led to the Korean War between North Korea and South Korea. Even though Stalin wasn't directly involved in some of the wars, he always helped these countries turn communist by funding them financially. Stalin, a greatly condescended politician, turned from a juvenile bank robber and rebellious revolutionary into Russia's greatest protector and unlikely hero. By paving the way for the Allies' World War II victory through winning key battles like Operation Barbarossa, forcing the German forces to retreat back into Berlin, and contributing to some of the last German defeats, he was able to turn the USSR into an industrialized nation that could match the might and power of other nations in the Cold War.